So this is going to be a recap of what you just were looking at in the first assignment we did for the executive branch. And basically, everything we know about the executive branch is in Article 2 of the Constitution. Talks about the president's qualifications, his or her role, their powers, and the different duties and the line of succession. To be president, you must be at least 35 years old, a natural born citizen, so born in the United States or on U.S. territory. So, for example, John McCain, who had been running for president, was born on a military base, not in the U.S., but still is eligible for citizenship. So somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California but was born in Austria, would not be eligible to become president. You also have to have lived in the United States for at least 14 years before becoming president. The main powers of the president are executive powers. He is the CEO, the chief executive officer of the country. Military powers, he is the commander-in-chief. He heads our nation's military. He actually does have some legislative powers, not obviously as extensive as Congress, but we'll go over those. Diplomatic powers, he is the chief diplomat, the chief representative of our country vis-a-vis other countries around the world. And he has some judicial powers that we'll talk about in terms of executive orders, which have become incredibly important. First, to the executive powers of the president, his job as the CEO of our country. So Congress passes the laws, but it's up to the president to carry them out. And sometimes Congress will pass a law that says we must have safe drinking water or safe or limiting air pollution. And then it's the president via the bureaucracy, via the cabinet departments, who actually write out the specifics of what that means. How much pollutant is allowed to be discharged into a stream? How much pollutant can be emitted by a factory into the air? What it means to have a safe workplace. All of these are nitty-gritty regulations that are part of the executive powers of the president. He also has the power to appoint people to head up those departments that write these regulations and carry out the laws, these cabinet departments. And he can remove anybody who he has appointed anytime he wants. So he has appointment power and he can fire them. The ordinance power is this executive order that we're going to go over in further detail. The executing the law, this executive power, comes from Article 2, Section 1, Clause 8, and also Article 2, Section 3, that take care power. He should take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So, ordinance power. The president has power to issue what are called executive orders. And presidents have used these increasingly over time and in some incredibly powerful and significant ways. When the president signs an executive order, which is a rule or a statement or saying what he wants to happen, it has the effect of law. It's not an actual law, but it has the power as if Congress had passed a law. Now, that being said, one president can issue an executive order, and the next president can come along and undo it. So sign an executive order that says the exact opposite, or Congress can pass a law that says the opposite of whatever the executive order is to say. So, executive order said. So we saw that when Obama was president, he was unable to urge Congress to pass immigration reform. And there was the category of people in the United States called the Dreamers. These were generally children and young adults whose parents had brought them into this country when they were little kids. It brought them over illegally. And so they've been living in this country for 5, 10, 15 years, going to school, joining the military, trying to um, have jobs like other Americans and get an education, but they were not US citizens because they had not gone through the, the immigration channels. And yet they'd never known any other country besides the United States. So they're a very sympathetic group of immigrants. And Obama wanted to protect them from deportation, from being sent back to the country where their parents came from. And so, because Congress was not passing immigration law, giving these dreamers a path to citizenship, Obama used this ordinance power, and through an executive order, he protected this group of immigrants, these dreamers, from deportation. This was very, very controversial because there were so many people impacted, and members of Congress felt like this was their responsibility, not the president's. But through this executive order, through this ordinance power, the president has the ability to do some pretty far-reaching things. He also has the appointing power. He appoints heads of the cabinet agencies and heads of departments, and then they in turn appoint other people who will carry out what the president wants to do. He appoints all federal judges, so not just the Supreme Court judges, but all of the judges in the appeals courts and the district courts as those vacancies come open. And he appoints the officers of the military. So in this way, the president appoints people who generally share his point of view, his worldview, and he can direct the federal government in a way to carry out his priorities and his way of thinking. As we said before, he can remove anybody who he's appointed, except Supreme Court justices. They are appointed for life, but anybody else he can get rid of. So the president has diplomatic powers. He is the one who goes out and negotiates with the Secretary of State and others, but with other countries, and is our face with other countries. He has the power to make treaties, to make executive agreements, and the power of recognition. And we're going to go into each of these. So the president can go and negotiate treaties with other countries. These are agreements that may regulate trade, they may regulate pollution agreements, anything of that sort. And if it is a treaty, a formal agreement, the president and the Secretary of State and others will negotiate it, but the Senate must give its approval with a 2/3 vote, which is very, very hard to get. So we don't see as many treaties as we see these executive agreements. Now, we talked briefly before about executive orders. Executive agreements are similar to executive orders, but executive agreements deal with foreign policy and other countries. They do not require the approval of the Senate, though sometimes the president can ask for a majority vote in the Senate to approve an executive agreement. That way he is getting buy-in from members of Congress. But the difference between an executive agreement and an executive order is these executive agreements are not binding on the next president. And finally, in the diplomatic realm, the president has what's called the power of recognition. And this is where the president can accept leaders of foreign countries, and by doing so, he recognizes that that person is indeed the leader of another country. And that can be a very big deal, particularly if two places, two areas are fighting over land or over dispute or who is the real leader of a given country. If the US president invites the leader of one of those fighting groups to the White House, he is giving recognition, legitimacy. He is saying, yes, I think you are the real leader of that country. So this can also give legitimacy or give power to a new country that's trying to break away from another one. We've seen recent examples of this with President Trump in Venezuela, where the US government does not support the current leadership in Venezuela, and instead they chose to recognize the opposition leader, Juan Guaido, in his battle to overthrow the current leadership and recognize him as the true president of Venezuela, even though he is not yet in power. We see it also in the historic dispute between China and Taiwan over who really is representing the Chinese people. We've seen it also in whether the US recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, because Jerusalem is a disputed area between the Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis, and what a president says about a capital can make policy and decide between two competing groups. President is the commander-in-chief. He's the head of our military. He can send troops into combat. And we're going to go over the War Powers Act of 1973, which talks about what the war powers of the president really are and Congress's role in declaring war and putting limits on what the president can do. But basically, the story of this is that while Congress is the only one who can actually declare war, we have not declared war since World War II, though we've been fighting many, many wars. And this has meant that the president has really been the one to assert much more power as commander-in-chief, much more control over where U.S. forces go than Congress has. So the balance of power in terms of the president's power versus Congress has really been tilted toward the president and away from Congress. The president has some legislative powers. Now, obviously, it's the Congress that is the one who holds hearings and passes laws. But the president can submit his ideas or recommendations to Congress. The president gives a State of the Union every year where he gives his ideas for what he thinks Congress should be doing and the direction we should be going. And he also has veto power. So this is where Congress passes a law or a resolution, and if the president doesn't like it, he can veto it and say no. And the only way it then becomes law is if 2/3 of both houses of Congress, both the House and the Senate, override the president. And in these times of political polarization, that is very hard to do. There's another type of veto that the president has. So Congress generally, a session of Congress, Congress has 2-year sessions, but they will take a recess, and when they are not in session during those 2 years, if they've passed a bill and then they take a recess, a little holiday, a little vacation, and they're not technically in session, and the president does not sign a bill, a piece of legislation, it does not pass. That's called a pocket veto. Finally, the president has judicial powers. So he can pardon people who have been found guilty of a crime. This has come up recently with President Trump talking about pardoning Michael Flynn, who was his national security advisor, who has been convicted of lying to federal prosecutors. He can commute somebody's sentence to reduce their sentence, to let them out of jail, which this president has done recently in a case that Kim Kardashian was advocating for a woman who was in prison. He can provide amnesty, which is forgiveness to a group of people, and he can postpone a sentence.